Hello, everyone. This is Sarah Rovner coming live from a hotel. I'm usually always coming live from a hotel. I figured that I'd put together a video today on a topic that a lot of people have questions about. And the big question that's been dominating the industry recently has been, why on earth are my insurance rates going up? It's probably the question that I get asked the most. And I actually sat down with a claims manager and senior underwriter at a major aviation insurance company, and we actually had a great conversation about why the insurance rates were going up when I was doing research for my upcoming presentation on the top 10 leading causes of aviation insurance claims. And believe it or not, the answer is not so simple as to why the rates are going up, but the answer to what can you do about it is actually a very simple solution. So I figured that I would be discussing that today with you guys. So I was doing some research for my upcoming presentation, and I asked the guys, okay, what are the top 5 leading causes of total loss insurance claims, and what are the top 5 causes of overall claims? And believe it or not, the top cause is not something you would really think about, but believe it or not, it's weather. And that was a kind of an interesting thing, because as pilots, we do all these things to try to mitigate the risk whenever we fly. We try to, prevent accidents by doing more training or, installing something in the airplane. But in reality, believe it or not, they were paying a lot of these insurance claims on things like hail damage, flood damage, Hurricane Harvey. They say, man, you get 13 claims just right off the bat when, a tornado rolls through. So believe it or not, that was the top cause. But there's some other ones that we can actually work on ourselves. So the big question, now, mind you, I'm not the expert, and in each aviation insurance company might have a different explanation as to why insurance rates are going up. But one thing to remember about insurance is that these insurance companies that, let's say, insure your Cessna 172 or your Super Cub or whatever airplane that you have, they also insure other risks as well. In fact, sometimes the companies share the risks together, and you might have one company that takes a portion of the risk on your policy, another that takes another. And so just because, hey, yeah, I fly a 172 doesn't mean that you're not going to get affected by, let's say, an accident in a 737. For example, the 737 MAX accidents. I mean, those were paid out across the board. Another interesting thing that I found out, and I actually had to do some research for this one as well, was, believe it or not, one thing that really impacts the bottom line of this particular insurance company is satellites. We don't think about it, but right now, according to sources, there's over 2,666 satellites, and I think that was in 2020, that are orbiting the Earth right now. And right now, they're on track to launch an average of 990. Some figures are saying up to 1,000 satellites are going to get launched annually. And these satellites that are getting launched are, they're expensive. In fact, they cost more than a brand new 737. And whenever one of those gets lost, it's like almost the equivalent of losing a 737. I mean, just an average cost of a satellite is probably somewhere around $190 million. And if it's something specialized, that number could easily double or triple. And believe it or not, the launch costs of a satellites are anywhere from 60 million to, I saw 600 million, depending on what type of satellite it is. So I know you think, oh, well, that's not really going to affect me, but these companies that insure general aviation, well, they also insure Part 135 operators, they also insure airlines, and they also insure space. That's not something you would think about, but they actually insure space. And so that actually drives up some of the premiums that you see, as well as, just look at the weather patterns. The fact that we had Hurricane Harvey, we've had an extremely active hurricane season over the past few years. Look at all the different types of damage in the tornadoes. I have a friend of mine who had an airplane that was damaged in a tornado. That right there is a total loss of many aircraft. And that kind of gets into my second question. So we're talking about aviation insurance. Another thing, too, is that aircraft have just gotten more expensive to repair. I was talking to the guy, and he says, man, the general aviation fleet is 40 to 50 years old. I mean, it's aging. And sometimes you can't even find parts for it anymore. And I said, well, do you actually set a different rate based on the handling characteristics of the airplane? I assumed that, you were more likely to have an insurance claim, let's say, in a Stearman than in a Cessna 172. And he said, believe it or not, it's not the handling characteristics at all that affect it. It has to do a lot with the repair costs. He says, like a Commander 112, you can't find parts for it. It's going to be extremely expensive to repair that as compared to something else. He said that there's even some airplanes out there that would probably be totaled out with hanger rash because they're composite airframes or they require special inspections should they actually get dinged or damaged. And these airplanes, they might not be that expensive of airplanes, but the cost to repair is actually really high. And they said, the cost of just, maintaining the airplane has gone up. I mean, insurance looks at all those things. They looked at the cost of repair whenever they're determining the rate. So just because an airplane might be trickier to handle or trickier to fly, that's actually not something that really, it does affect the rate, but they said, believe it or not, the thing that affects it the most is the ability to repair, the availability of parts, mechanics that can repair it. Just something simple like a sheet metal repair could end up costing, 10, 20 hours of labor, even if it's something extremely simple. I mean, if you look at the rebuild for my Super Cub, I mean, in parts, it wasn't that much, but it sure was a lot in labor. And so the cost of labor has gone up significantly, and things just take time. And, if you compound like what things costed 20 years ago, and you add on 3%, 3%, 3% every year, you come up with a very high number. And next thing you know, you're paying anywhere, if you're maybe in a rural area, $85 an hour for a mechanic, anywhere to about 115, which is where I live. And so when you're adding in all those costs, it doesn't take much for something as simple as, a damage to a part of the airplane to all of a sudden exceed what it's even worth repairing for. And that right there is what's caused a lot of airplanes to be totaled out and they'd be declared total losses. It's not because the damage was necessarily substantial. It was really interesting. I was talking to one of the claims managers, and they said, a lot of times airplanes get totaled out for hail damage, believe it or not. And they said that, hail damage, I mean, the airplane's still airworthy, but the cost of tearing off all those skins, putting them back on, repainting them, that right there is going to far exceed, the value of the airplane. So you have airplanes flying around that have been declared total losses, and they could go out and fly it the very next day, and, and it's completely airworthy. And yet the insurance company has still paid out a claim on that airplane. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Just on statistics, I was talking about the cost of satellites earlier. Just to put it into perspective, satellite 190 million on average, and that obviously excludes, outliers that are extremely expensive. 737-700, which is kind of an older airplane, 89.1 million. A MAX, a Boeing 737 MAX 7, 99.7 million, MAX 8, 121.6 million, MAX 10, 134.9 million. And obviously these numbers can be different. But if you just take a look at a perspective, I mean, you could lose, if you lose just a few satellites, that's more than the value of, a 737. Of course, you're also having to deal with the loss of life, which is also, a big, probably one of the biggest expenses of the insurance companies, would be, medical and, property damage is part of it, but it's also all the other expenses they pay out. So whenever you say, hey, why are my insurance rates rising? It's not really your fault, and it might not even be General Aviation's fault, even though we've really not started out a good year. And last year was just a record bad year for aviation accidents. We're definitely not helping it, but at the same time, some of these things are happening beyond our control. So the next question I had for the insurance company was, what can I do to lower my rates and to be less of a risk? And they said that it was actually an interesting conversation because we were actually talking about the leading causes of insurance claims. There was loss of directional control. I says, oh, you're talking about ground loops. And they said, you'd be surprised. Most of our claims are tricycle gear, loss of directional control on landing. They go through a fence or a ditch. And I said, well, is this happening more with tail draggers? And they said, well, it's about proportionate, the proportion of, nose wheel airplanes to tail wheel airplanes out there is probably about the proportion for loss of directional control claims. So even though, you think, oh, tail draggers are more likely to ground loop, that's true. They're actually seeing a same number of claims pretty much for both nose wheel and for tail wheel. Like I said, this isn't going to be the same across every insurance company, but they say that loss of directional control is a leading cause, and they say it's not unique to tail wheel airplanes, and that these nose wheel airplanes have way more claims, and like I said, it's very proportionate to the amount of nose wheel versus tail wheel airplanes out there. And I talked to him about it. I said, well, what about airplanes that just have weird handling characteristics? You always hear these campfire stories about some airplane that has some type of crazy characteristics. Well, there are some out there like that, right? Especially when you start getting into the experimental world, maybe the Lancers have a reputation more than, let's say, a 182. But that being said, he said, with the really high-risk stuff, we just deny it because they're a major aerospace company. I bet a lot of people have their policies through this company. They said if it's just something that's too crazy or too strange, We don't insure it. We're not going to insure flying cars, or well, they might, but we're not going to insure anything too crazy. If it's too crazy like that, they said we're just going to decline it. There will be a company out there who probably will pick it up. But he said that, believe it or not, the rates aren't really as tied to the characteristics of the airplane as you would think. You say, oh, like this airplane's a ground loop monster. Well, believe it or not, like I said, it has to do a lot with repair value. And I said, what is the single thing I can do as an owner to try to reduce the cost of my insurance? And you know what his answer was? Make and model. I know it sounds kind of crazy. They said make and model. They say, they hear about claims all the time where, somebody gets an airplane and, Joe has flown everything in the book, probably an Air Force test pilot, and, he's flown, 500 different types of airplanes, but he jumps into his friend's airplane and he thinks it's going to fly the same, and then something happens. He said you would be surprised how often that happens. And that the biggest risk factor that they have seen overall is make time and make and model. And then the other thing too is just getting recurrent training. I said, well, what about like airline pilots versus GA? I said, is there a way you can quantify how many hours makes somebody more likely to be in a claim or something? And they said, you probably have better data than that, than we have, believe it or not. But he said that a lot of times time and hours doesn't necessarily equate to experience. He said that, these airline, he says it all the time, the claims guy, he said, I see it all the time, these airline pilots, I'm at fault here too, jump into these GA airplanes and they end up getting in over their head. And they said, well, just because you fly a 777 doesn't mean that you're qualified to fly this 172. And they see a lot of claims like that. They're higher time pilots, ATPs. They said the most important thing you can do is time and make and model and recent experience. Recent experience in that make and model. He said, if you're an airplane owner, the best thing you can possibly do for yourself is fly your airplane and fly it a lot. and these two people were both airplane owners, or I think they might have owned an airplane at one time, and they're active pilots. And he said, yeah, that's the best thing you can do for your insurance rate is recent time and make and model. And, I completely feel with him on that. I mean, I'm one of those people who, a few years ago, having a bunch of time in one type of airplane, they would probably cover you without a checkout in a new type of airplane. But recently, as an agent, I found that they're not willing to cover you even if the time is similar. I had trouble getting insurance on a guy who had over, I think it was like 600 hours in a Citabria to even fly a Champ. They would not let him solo the Champ unless he got a checkout. Even a 1 hour checkout. And I remember like back in the day, I said, oh, I've flown these types of airplanes, and they would just cover you even with no time and make and model. I got covered to fly an Air Tractor 502 with 0 time and make and model. Now, mind you, that's a 1-seat airplane. But I had no time and make and model. I had time in similar aircraft. But nowadays, it's like impossible. Like you can't get experience without having experience, and it's this catch-22 that puts everybody in a bind, and they're like, well, I guess I'm just gonna have to fly it uninsured for a few hours. And I remember listening to a Mike Bush presentation. He's like, yeah, they wouldn't insure me, so I just flew it uninsured or something for the first few hours. And I hear that all the time, and it's kind of just a crazy situation because insurance companies, it's gone from a soft market to a hard market, and they're really not budging on these requirements. I saw something on another group where somebody was trying to, an insurance company was trying to require the new owner to get a checkout in this type of airplane, and he kept trying to explain to the guy it was a 1-seat airplane, and the insurance company was like, no, he's got to get a checkout in it. And it's like, well, how exactly do you do that? So it's this big catch-22. But, I think that the problem is that the insurance companies have seen an abnormally high amount of claims and incidents and accidents and people that had very little to no experience in make and model, or they had experience but it just wasn't recent. It was, these were high-time pilots. They hadn't flown these types of airplanes in a while, and then just something gets away from them. We made the joke that, we're talking about, gear up landings. I say, the first thing you do after a gear up landing, right? He's like, what? He's like, you put the gear handle down. And we just laughed about that. And he said, you wouldn't believe how many reports we get from the pilots, and they say it's always a gust of wind or something like that. But I understand for like each individual situation. I sure have been hit by a gust of wind on landing, and I'll admit to that too. But he said that when you look at the overall trend of all the claims that are coming in, he said the best thing you can do for yourself is to fly your plane and fly it often, or fly that make and model often. He said that right there is the key to keeping yourself out of having an insurance claim. So I hope that this was good information. I hope you tune in next week. I'm doing a fast team presentation on the top 10 leading causes of aviation insurance claims. It's kind of a spin-off from the top 10 leading causes of fatal general aviation accidents. I mean, after all, who has the biggest financial interest in reducing risk or even quantifying or calculating risk? It's the insurance companies. You know, the government, the FAA, doesn't get funding based on the total number of aviation accidents, but the insurance companies do. So if it's one person who's really looking out and trying to reduce aviation accidents and trying to reduce claims being paid out, it's these insurance companies, and they're keeping statistics, they're keeping all this data. Even if something doesn't make it to the NTSB or FAA database, it could be significantly affecting everybody's claims or in everybody's premiums. So I hope you found this to be very interesting. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Obviously, I don't have all the answers, and unfortunately, I don't know if anybody really does, but I hope this gives you some insight as to what carriers, how they work, how they insure risk, how they quantify things, and the things that you can do as a pilot in order to lower your premiums and be in that lower risk bracket and just be a safer pilot overall. Well, thank you once again for tuning in. I wish you some safe flying and blue skies and tailwinds.